Hello, innovators. I am Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Marcus-Kirsch. He is the author of Wicked Company, as well as the host of the Wicked podcast. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath podcast.
Thank you, Dustin. Nice to be here.
All in all, this is a show by PolyInnovator, so I like to have people say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hello, all you innovators out there.
Hello and welcome to the Polymath podcast interviews and discussions. So the way I like to break the ice is to have you share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Wow, for legal reasons, probably not, but no, what people don't know about me, Jesus. I'm generally, I talk too much to most people, so I give away way too much. What's the kind of thing that people don't know? I guess so. I don't know. Well, I still have the habit of, and yeah, just I think my friends only know that. Even so, I deal with a lot of tech. And I used to be a designer, but even very graphic-y kind of designer. And I dealt with a lot of tech, used to be a coder. However, if you find me in a bar and I'm sitting by myself, which I sometimes do, me and my laptop, I had a few drinks, I asked for a piece of paper and I started drawing. So I used to actually be trained a bit as an illustrator, but I choose not to do that as a job because I never wanted anyone to tell me what to draw because I loved it too much. So I still find myself observing people and doing really super fast little sketchy drawings, and I still have those. I have them in a little pile in a little box as well. That's sort of all these little pieces of paper and trying to catch a moment of people doing weird things, you know, people who meet each other and people interact with each other, or people just hang out at the bar. And it's a really nice thing to have those moments still where you just go and you really catch someone and you catch a little bit of a story. So I still like to do that, oddly, even after over 20 years since my BA and since I've done that. So yeah, you can find me draw alone by myself with a glass of alcohol in bars.
I'll have to go to that bar, buy you a drink, and then do some interesting things that you can sketch.
Whenever you're in London, man, just come over.
It's interesting because when I go to bars, I often meet random people and I'll just approach a random table, which I guess I had friends from Sweden and I guess it was like taboo to approach a table, but like
oh really? Okay.
Yeah, but I'm gregarious. You seem very social as well, so it's like one of those things where I want to talk to people. I want to go to find those new people.
I had that in my local. I normally, after the book I wrote in the bar, essentially there in the corner on my laptop. Even with the noise around, I can sort of tune it all out, and it's really interesting. And everyone's going to ask me, how can you write a book here? It's like, I need the background noise, like the white noise. I need it. It helps. And then I can really super zoom in and focus. It's a really weird thing. I think there's a couple of people who have that too. Others go like, I couldn't possibly do that. So do that, but after, I normally hang out at the bar, normally know the bar stuff. And place around the corner they had there, normally I like to play pool at times. So I would go after the last drink, go to the pool table and then do the same thing. Approach people on a table who might not want to play pool at all and go, hey, do you want to play some pool? Right. So I did that quite a bit with strangers, which is fun too, and you can do that sometimes. And I like to be able to do it and just go, hey, thanks for the game. Bye, that's it. As simple as it goes.
It's and just peace out. Yeah. No, but it's interesting how you're able to focus in that kind of like hard noise around you, because there is some people who need music. They can't focus without having music or having some kind of noise in the background. I hate being in silence, but I also can't stand too much noise. So it's a very weird dynamic. So I'm impressed at your ability to write in that loud.
See, it's always odd because there's noises I can't have around. And as you know, if I would have like a barking dog or something, that type, and it's probably patterns, it's the kind of pattern thing that goes. And one of the weirdest thing I noticed after I moved to London at some point in a bar, and that goes to patterns is so I'm from Germany. So my brain is wired to German language, right? But you have no idea how wired it actually is. So after I arrived in London, I learned, so my English wasn't that good, but after about half a year, pretty good. So I learned very quickly. However, I remember, must have been in year 1 or 2. So I was in a bar that was quite noisy, talking to people in English. I was talking to them. They were only like a meter away from me. And I was like, sorry, what? And I really had a hard time listening in on what they were saying. However, there must have been someone 3-4 meters away, way more, that was speaking German. I was like, someone speaks German here. I could hear it. Just the pattern came through and landed on my brain way more easily than that new language I had that was so much closer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was totally fascinating that how much your brain is really used to a pattern, then just that's the way it can listen so much more efficiently than something that is much closer to you in a better context. It's bizarre, but yeah,
At that time, were you still mentally translating English, or did you just know it fluently?
People always ask that. Not that that's always a part of the conversation, but it's a question I had often, and I think I think in pictures, not in language.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I switch back, and that probably goes back to like thinking fast and slow, I guess. But you know, when you do math, so I would normally think if I would have to calculate something that's bigger, that's not just in the small number spectrum, I would have to start nearly speak out like 5, you know, like in German, like 15, 20, whatever. So literally my language would switch back to the brain pattern as well that it's more comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on how hard the question is, then it sort of switches back maybe to the language. But generally, if I look at my dreams and everything else, you know, people ask me, oh, in your dreams, do people speak English? It's like, I don't know. I know they talk and I know I understand them, but I couldn't make out which language it is. I don't remember, and my brain doesn't work like that.
Well, I asked because becoming a polyglot is something that's fascinating. Being able to speak tons of different languages and then switch between them flawlessly. And so at that particular point, you said you were like year 1, year 2 at the bar. So I was wondering if your brain just hadn't switched over fully in that case, like, or maybe in that particular moment. I don't know. It's just curious.
It's different levels. So it's definitely, I mean, you know, I would usually, I'm older now, but I would recommend anyone to learn at least one other language, even if you think it's a language that's really close and similar. The further it is away, you know, for example, if I would like to learn Mandarin, you know, it's a massive gap, and it's like, and people say you will never learn if you're not a native speaker, you never get to a certain level. English is pretty close. It's not too far away. It's got it borrows a lot from French. So my ex-wife is from Colombia, Spanish, so I understand a fair bit of Spanish, never quite learned it. So my daughter now grows up with English, speaks Spanish, and a bit of German. So it's like mad. I'm curious how she's going to be in 10 years.
Yeah.
For me, it was basically that, in the school system, it didn't really work for me. I was not a great pupil, like student of the languages, more into science. So I had trouble with it. So when I came over for my MA, I was quite intimidated. And I had literally headaches in the first 3 months when I came home, because I started in the second week when I arrived in London. Lots of other things going on. I was quite stressed out, and it was really hardcore, like straight into MA in, it was called computer-related design over at the Royal College of Art. Now it's called, or used to be called, design interaction. So it's basically art and technology together. You do innovation, you build weird stuff, and you build new concepts and ideas around people's behavior. Really interesting stuff, but very conceptual, right? A lot of things we were figuring out, you couldn't really build yet, right? So you had to build prototypes, you have to be able to talk around it, build stories around it. A lot of like storytelling that we were taught there. And a lot of human-centered design approach, like, you know, IDEO is doing with experimentation and prototyping and typical Stanford design thinking stuff. And so when you get thrown into that as not a native speaker, geez, you know, the conversation and you have to follow there on that level are challenging. So headache for 3 months, and then you get all the basics down. Then you learn how to speak in that course, because that's all you do, right? So you speak a particular language. Good thing is we're dealing with so many different things that are very mainstream as well. Like, what do people do? Are they sitting at home? Are they waiting for the bus? As much as tech, and can we build an interface that is a speech level, you know, AI interface of doing stuff. So you learn a good broad thing, so you can talk about anything fairly quickly. The really nice thing I found about it was that I had to simplify the way I explain something, which is really hard. Because the easy one is you just throw a lot of complexity into some explanation. Everyone can be complex and confusing and complicated. It's really, really hard to simplify things down. You know, that's why advertising, these kind of slogans are so hard to create, because how do you get it exactly right? Every word's exactly there for the right reason, right? So it was a tough process, but that helped me a lot to learn the language really quickly. So after 3 months, no headaches, then the rest of the year, I got away with a lot. And then eventually, I think year 2, I had one moment that was just hilarious. And I probably need to explain a bit of culture things here. So London, so being over in England, Germany and England share, I think Germany and America nearly share more cultural things than England. I mean, England, you get a lot of the English music and that kind of stuff, and fashion and those kind of things. But a lot of is from US culture. So one of the songs that came over, I remember, that didn't really land in Germany from the UK, was some guy from the 70s or early 80s, I think late 70s. It was a song called like "Hit Me with Your Rhythm Stick," hit me, a really weird top chart thing with a guy really funnily painted, and I remember that being such an oddity. And a friend of mine, student colleague, approached me, and he had just done this interactive thing with Morris dancers, which are these kind of pagan English. The guys sort of dance around like a May kind of tree thing, but they hit sticks together, and they have bells on their feet and stuff like that. It's all sorts of weird, and people look at them differently. Some like it, some hate it. It exists. It's there. And so he built something interactive around and made the sticks interactive. So whenever you would dance around and hit things together, something would happen. It was some installation thing. So I knew him, and I knew the work, and he approached me in the art bar or college, and he's like, "Hey, Marcus, can I ask you a question?" Whatever. I was like, "Yeah, hit me with your rhythm stick." And kind of when you suddenly realize, and he was like, "Wow, you're not English, right?" It's like, no. It's like response like that, where you can suddenly tap into cultural things, translate them, think about it in English, and respond to something, connect these things. That's when you get from just speaking it to really picking up on small bits and pieces, and you kind of know where words really come from. You sometimes start seeing the difference between everyone's using certain English words in a particular way, but you actually know, they mean something else, and most people don't even know it, which is in every language. Germany, the same. Germans use German words sometimes without knowing what they really mean. So you get to that level, and that was quite, that was quite a thing, after a year, we're like, fuck, I can do this now, to some extent. It's interesting to get to that level. I think, and that probably was sort of the last level. Since then, it's just been polishing, iterating, getting to know people, and then starting to understand language within context, just like any other language. It's still easier. I still go back to my home, and when I speak to my old mates, it's the way I can play with language is still a different level. It's very different. It's still more fluent. There's different games we play with language in order to be funny. Yes, Germans are funny, and it still goes down much easier. So it's interesting. There's all sorts of levels and layers I think you can get to, and it's beautiful. Yeah.
Super fascinating concept, and thank you for sharing that story. It's super interesting. And I think it also kind of leads into your whole mindset of just being able to bring things together and keeping that innovation minded as well, even with languages. And so I wanted to dig in here a little bit. You got your book and your podcast going on, but what got you started before all that? What was your mindset?
You mean before I came to the idea of the book, or earlier than that?
Just really earlier than that. Like what was your mindset before you had the book and the podcast?
Yeah. So I think, the MA back in 2000 really opened up a lot of doors. Before that, I was towards the end of my BA back that I finished up in Hamburg. I pretty much, the dot-com boom was just raging. It was all about websites and the tech behind it, early tech. And I was diving into it. At the time, CD-ROMs was still a thing. Remember those things?
Yeah.
And sort of the tech was different. The things you could do with it were different, because on the internet you couldn't. It was way before you could stream video or stream even audio at the time. It was all very early days. So you started playing around with it, JavaScript and that kind of stuff. So I was always interested from a creative perspective, being a designer, to go, what can you do with a website? The first time I ever saw a website, I remember, all I remember was the Keanu Reeves movie, Johnny and Mnemonic, and he goes on the internet, everything's 3D and flying around, and it's awesome. And you go and then you look at a really shabby newspaper page, essentially on the web. If anyone remembers, those early days, and it was just nothing going on. Everything was static, and so you start dabbling around. So early on, it was always for me, I want to explore something. I want to try something new. What do I have to do to get there? Well, you learn another skill. You're gonna dive into it. The benefit for me was when I was growing up as a kid, back in Germany, we had the ZX Sinclair 81 and the C64 Commodore as the first programmable computers at home. So I grew up as a generation of having at home a actual computer you could code on. Very simple, but you could do. So you would understand computer principles and or code language principles, and therefore I got quite quickly into JavaScript, HTML, and all this stuff, and then later on into Director Flash and all this stuff. So I started to just collect tools, and I love to play with stuff and figure out puzzles. I think my brain's just a bit more receptive to that. I just enjoy it. So I just try to do new things, and therefore I just learned new stuff. It came natural to me. I always had done that as a kid, and so I kept doing it. Already by the time I had started being a designer and going into like Photoshop and all these things, I could code. And then later when the .com boom was happening, you know, I could create websites and design them and do other things, front end, back end. And that helped me then get to particular opportunities, like very good old friend of mine back in Hamlets, creative director. He saw me playing around with this stuff, and he's like, this is all cool. Can we put it in front of a client? It's like, sure. You know, so he dragged me into every pitch. And that got me further and further into the business side of things. So you start realizing there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of things you build. What more is there? And instead of keep doing websites at the end of 99, I looked for new things. And one of those things was that course over at the Royal College. And through the Royal College, I learned this whole design thinking approach of like, well, if you have an idea, do some research. So I learned research tools, human-centered research, customer centricity, those kind of things. It wasn't called customer centricity at the time. And then again, so you learn more of that, and then you get into the art part of it. What does the art part mean? You know, what's the meaning of behavior and culture and all these things significant? So, you know, by that time, so I had design, tech, I had art, I had you know, all sorts, and starting to learn different methodologies about innovation. And it just became more and more interesting, because then you have psychology and behavior of people. And I'm just naturally curious. So, okay, if I can learn this in a few months, dabble with it, get a job afterwards, the better. And I was never quite looking for a job. I was always looking for, where's the next interesting thing for me? What skills do I have to learn? And I started learning them. So I often afterwards got to places where people would often tell me, I'm not sure you can do that. It's like, great, challenge accepted.
Yeah,
right?
try me.
And yeah, and because you've been through so many doors before, you know that, well, you know, it's just another door. And I think it's similar to me coming from a small town, having moved up to a bigger town to start my BA, moving to Hamburg, which is pretty big over in the north again, and then in London. And after the first 2 years in London, I went over to Dublin and came back to London after a few months. So you're traveling through different contexts, you meet different people and different environments, and you're just getting more and more comfortable to work within them and learn as quick as you can, because you're curious and you're getting used to it. And I think, you know, a lot of people I meet that I do workshops now are not quite that, because they never had a lot of these experience. For them, it would be even hard to just change their job within their own industry, right, or learn something within their own job. And it's interesting to see this now. But generally, I saw all this happening, and I was always I think about by 2010, I was looking, it was, you know, 8 years after my MA, I was like, I had expected at this point every designer to be a great coder,
right,
as well, right? And that never happened because the silos, right? So I started to look at this stuff and go like, hang on a second, I'm going through this stuff like butter, like this and this and this and this, and I can do these. I can do still what most developers can do, can still do what most designers can do. Where's my extra value, or why is not everyone else doing that? And that was a puzzle for me, because I saw a lot of companies and organizations struggle doing these things, struggle for people to learn, for them to try new things, to think in a new way. And that's when this whole thing just built up, this mindset of like, hang on a second. So my mindset doesn't have a problem with it, is not overwhelmed by that. Every article in every publication I read talks about it's too fast, it's overwhelming, we don't know what the tech does, how this functions, no one knows where front and back is, right? And I'm like, why? It's, you know, yeah, am I too? So eventually I think I just realized that I was quite privileged to go through particular areas and contexts that gave me that information, where people were quite focused on doing that and helped me learn that. At the same time, I had my own drive on top of it to go, but I want to go there. You know, no one told me to leave Germany, go to London, learn a new language, and jump into this MA, right? So it's a mixture of both personal drive and the context, if you get a good context. Because I've been in a few contexts where you go in there, you want to do good stuff, and people don't let you because they don't want to, actually. So that puzzled me, and I said, well, I want to help people to feel a bit more like me, because I feel comfortable with this. They're not. They should be comfortable with that, right? And that's sort of where this whole thing started around, how can I, you know, instead of just talking to, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 people a week, maybe write a book and talk to 1,000 people and tell them a bit how I think and take the fear away and the being overwhelmed. And that sort of was the starting point to trying to get this book together. And this, I think what I thought was a new narrative we need for this new mindset to actually understand, to give the problem a real name. That's normally a good starting point.
Well, and what I'm seeing here, Marcus, too, is that you were talking about the silos, and too many people were stuck in their silos. And it's almost a difference between the specialist and a generalist mindset. For you, it came naturally, not only just due to your drive and curiosity, but I think also, too, you said something about timing there, which I think is interesting. Perhaps you took your degrees at the perfect time and intervals of when the knowledge transfer was at its prime, at least for that particular subject. So when you got to your degree, you got probably a more direct learning experience for that particular subject area. And maybe that's how you're able to understand it more quickly. Or perhaps it's just literally your internal drive to do it. So it's interesting to think about.
I think there's two things you just mentioned, and it's a really good point you're making. So there's one, yet again, about time and context and where you can learn these things. I think in terms of timing, I would just go with things. When I now look back, it was interesting the way the project I worked on ended up being sort of similar to where innovation trickled through industries. So when you look back at the first industries that were hit, it's pretty much entertaining. You look at Napster and all these things happening, and that was all like music industry, entertainment. Then you go from that straight into advertising because they're trying to be quite entertaining. So those were sort of the early industries being hit, and afterwards you have automotive, healthcare, insurance, and now you finally have government and all these things happening, and banking. And the reason for that obviously is, or I think obviously is, entertainment, no one dies of it if you shift a few things around. Healthcare, very different subject matter, right? And then you go into government, you go into banking. That's where the whole world relies on. So you can't just meddle with this stuff. So you can't just hack it. You actually will seriously break things or kill people. And that's just a normal kind of how these things are stacked. So, but that's why now, essentially, 15 years later, compared to, let's say, 2005, when it was still early days for advertising to pick up on it, now you have a lot of banking and insurance and those guys picking up on the same stuff. So, but with the silos, it's, yes, look, that really goes back to, that's the big subject matter, right? That I try to convey in the book. If we structure organizations and even our learning system in a way that you come out as a pre-siloed person. And the main reason, I only find it out through the research, there's even a word for that. So, Henry Ford back in the days had the trouble to say, right, I don't have robots, I don't have communication tools. How can I scale this? How can I mass produce? Because I just don't, everyone I would hire, people were too expensive, because if you train them in a wider set of skills, like the crafts were, they were too expensive. So he wasn't able to hire 5,000 people and then mass produce cars. It would be way too expensive. So what did he do? Well, he grabbed people just from the street, untrained people, and said, all you need to do, stand here, do this one thing. And he called it de-skilling. So, and he moved all the thinking. So why am I doing this? How can I improve this? Whatever, to the management layer. So he basically separated sort of the brain from the physical body, right? The bodies were just doing stuff. Didn't need to know or understand. And management were supposed to be the smart guys. And that worked really well because he could get really cheap people in who were hardly trained. They could do the job. Management did the rest. And so, he did that. Apart from this, other things he did were quite interesting that I might talk about later. But generally, he made mass production work or sustainable. So it was a great idea for the time. Thing is, now we have robots and we have comm tools and everything. We don't need this anymore, right? But we're still structuring companies like that. So the reason why we have a strategy department and a delivery department and a financial department, all these different things where people never talk to each other, it's exactly that. It's like one silo of one skill, and it's now causing all sorts of trouble.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I created this show, because I think that we probably should have stopped doing this more industrial revolution archaic mindset, so to speak. It worked back then, but now at this point we're stifling companies and people and schools because of this old mindset that we've kept. And so I created this show to try to exemplify people who I consider polymathic like yourself, and show that, like, hey, it's much more common than you might think. Maybe you didn't even realize that you were one or not. I think you probably did, or just at the very least acknowledge that. But some people just don't even think about it. There might be entrepreneurs who are polymathic and only have seen themselves as an entrepreneur. So I just wanted to exemplify that. And digging into the questions here, because we haven't actually touched the questions yet. You started a podcast with a new book, those being the Wicked Podcast and Wicked Company, respectively. What drove you to create them at this point?
Yes. So the book, as I mentioned a bit earlier, is that I wanted to reach more people because I understood that, me by myself, it's going to take me years to get this thing out. So let's write a book. So I wrote the book, put it out there, and I started to, so that's my first resource and asset to go, hey, want to know about me? Go read the book. So, and I can now get that out to thousands of people, if not more. I'm lucky. The podcast came naturally out of that. So because the book is basically sort of introduction to the whole thing. You go like, hey, what is this? What is a wicked problem? Mm-hmm. And just to maybe talk to your listeners and innovators out there who are not familiar with that. So the wicked problem is essentially it's a term from the 50s, 60s, comes from a German professor who moved eventually to Stanford. And he worked on urban planning and those kind of really complex projects. And when they looked at the success rate of an engineering or scientific approach to solving these, they had a high failure rate. They couldn't figure it out. It kept moving about and wasn't stable. So they really couldn't solve it. Because usually when you have science and engineering, they're really good at dealing with what they call tame problems, which are problems that you can understand fully, have enough information, and therefore you can actually find one solution that you never have to improve because it's just there. Good example is building a bridge. Mm-hmm. It's from A to B. Those points won't change. You build it over, it will work until it breaks down. Same with so complexity, interestingly, is not a characteristic that is part of a wicked problem. You can have a tame problem that's complex. For example, you build a airliner, super complex. I don't know how many thousand million parts in there, right? But it's not a tame problem because it's a known issue to solve. It's very contained. You build it. It's got a million parts. Fine, you can tackle that.
Yeah.
The real characteristics for the wicked problems are you will not get enough information to fully understand it enough to build this one solution, first of all. Secondly, and that's even more important, and we see a lot of things now that then make sense. The wicked problem, one of the other characteristics is that it keeps moving. So while you're working on it, because of its own dynamics, it keeps evolving. Therefore, by the time you got your solution ready, it has probably moved on a bit. You putting the solution in there, implementing it into its context, will further change it. It won't fully solve it, but will further create other problems, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a moving target, and that's the biggest thing. And when you look at things like agile and all the other iterative progressing, the main reason why they are is they have identified that there is some kind of characteristic like that.
Right.
And therefore those things started to pop up. However, so at Stanford, then some other people started to look at methodologies to tackle those, and they came up with things like design thinking. So even I didn't know that design thinking was originally developed to solve wicked problems. I thought it was solving any problem, right? It wasn't a distinction. Rarely came across that. I don't think most service designers, design thinkers, don't know if they know that particular fact. Knowing that, you go, right, okay, if that's so different, then we need different organizations, right? So that's the biggest breaking point where you go, mass production is a tame problem. COVID-19 is a wicked problem. And you see how much havoc COVID-19 rages, not just the virus itself, but actually all the systems it affects, right? And then you put that in and you put testing in. When you put testing in, or you tell people to stay home, and then they do this, and you do this, and then they do that. It's this moving target thing, right? And that's sort of, or even when you say people stay home, they still carry it. The second it came out, they delay it. So it's that's where it doesn't really solve, and it has very different dynamics. That is now true, in my opinion, as well for companies and organizations. So we looked at that wicked problem and said, this is the thing I need to get out as a story. People need to hear about that because I think this is what surrounds us now. And then the podcast naturally came out of that because while I was looking and writing the book and having gone through a lot of different practices from design, service design, and bumped into enterprise architecture, systems thinking, all these things, They're all trying to do the same thing. They're trying to solve a problem for an organization or business. If you have that, then you have a problem, because you have 5 or 6 different practices. They're all sitting in their own silos with their own language or whatever. And they don't talk to each other that much, but they have to work together. And then they contradict each other, or they disagree with each other, not for the right reason, sometimes for the wrong reason, because they're using different words. I remember sitting in meetings with enterprise architects just to define what an artifact is. They have a term called an artifact. What is it? Is it an Excel sheet or something else? And everyone has a different idea. So the podcast therefore exists to look at those different aspects and puzzle pieces of how to better solve wicked problems, because it needs a lot of different parts.
Yeah.
So we interview authors of books that are relevant to that puzzle and talk to them about, constant learning, behavioral science, improvement of enablement, leadership, self-managing teams, all these different bits and pieces and ideas, and sort of drive them a bit down back into reality and go, right, if that's true, where are the themes? What works, what doesn't? That's sort of where the Wicked podcast came from, which probably is going to build up content for the follow-up book to the Wicked company. So that's the book and the podcast.
Yeah, awesome. I love it. And I noticed you have a little under a dozen episodes released now. Where do you see the podcast going?
Yeah, so I think it just keeps going at the moment. One thing to look at is Troy Norcross and me. So Troy's my co-host. He's a specialist in blockchain, and also from Missouri. Hey, he.
It's crazy, small world.
Yeah, it is a small world, isn't it? All comes swings and roundabouts. So episode 8, we did sort of a summary, and I think we'll keep doing that. So one thing is about that we're trying to work a bit harder to. In the beginning of the podcast, we have 5 minutes to talk about the takeaways, just us two, and afterwards there's the interview where we dig a bit deeper into the book with the author. And the 8th episode we took, where we said, well, let's take those 7 books, have a look at it, and talk a bit more about the themes, the common patterns, the common things. Where is it that people describe the same thing in different words? And then tell people look, if you hear this, if you hear that, it's the same thing. It's not confusing because it's 2 things. It's the same thing, the same principle. I think this is really important because regardless how you look at it, our world is very, very complex and widespread and wicked. Hey, so you need to bring some things together and simplify some things that you can, because otherwise you can't have a conversation. If you can't have a conversation, you can't bring people together. If you can't bring people together, you can't solve bigger problems. And that's sort of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we have to learn to be more concise in our language and be able to teach people. Just for context, I've taught swim lessons and physical exercise for nearly a decade now. And so using that knowledge of teaching, that's how I can explain ideas usually pretty well. I don't know your history about that, but I think it's interesting.
Oh, it's super interesting. So I don't know if he's one of your listeners. So I'm an old skater, and one of my favorite skaters is Rodney Mullen, which invented probably most of the modern skate tricks. So he's probably more significant than Tony Hawk, and Tony Hawk's the more popular skater that everybody knows back from the days. There's no whole generation of new ones. However, he is really interesting because he's really amazing at math. So he's a big thinker, and he's done some of the most complex, weird, innovative tricks in the world. You look at that, and when you're a skater, you go, why would he even think of this? It's insane.
Or how,
right?
Yeah.
So his level of innovation of skill set is amazing. Skill set wise, he's just trained hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. He's known for going skating in the middle of the night where there's light, and he just keeps practicing. So it's really, really heavy practice and trial. So there's a really interesting, on YouTube, there is a video about his history. Interesting part is that moment where he explains how he functions, how he learns. And he says, right, okay, so I know all these things. I know what I want to do, and then I break it down, right? And then I have a trick, and there's a lot of different parts of the trick, where my foot is, where the truck sits on the edge with the board on whatever table or whatever he jumps on. And then he takes it all apart, and then he just focus on one thing, and he tries that and tries that again till he gets it. He knows exactly where the weight is and that and then that. And then he stacks it all up with the stuff he knows, and he goes, and then he progresses, and he's done it, right? And it's this kind of approach that is amazing to see how learning works.
Yeah.
And more interestingly enough, so we had a podcast, I think it was number 3 or 4, with Jeff Colvin, whose book Talent is Overrated. He looks at the science of learning, and he looks a lot at what does it take athletes to progress. And funnily enough, I think it's the same thing how everybody else learns. So they're not just talented and therefore they're better, because if you know any high performing athlete, they train every day. They train harder than everyone, you know, and that by itself, yeah. So the thing is, that the interesting part is that, or the significant part to step back is not the 10,000 hours, is actually once you've done something, if you step back and then you go and reflect and you basically tap back into your B brain and you go, okay, I know all that, fine, but what just happened here? That's when learning actually happens. So not when you're doing the thing. So he said, if a top 10 tennis player wins a game, he doesn't improve his performance. That doesn't do it. It's actually when he steps back, analyzes, tries a few things and adjusts, that's where the learning happens. So when he stresses his system essentially, or challenges his system, doing that and thinking outside of that and rethinking it and stepping back and looking at himself, that's sort of when people actually learn, which is then interesting for organizations because that doesn't happen. You know, you go from project to project. The one thing that's absolutely missing all the time, mainly allegedly in order to create more value, more benefit, is like on to the next one, produce more. It's like, if you don't step back and learn from the mistakes of the last one, you keep running a bad machine, you keep running, no one learns anything, no one improves, the next project's not going to benefit from it because people don't have time to learn. And I see this all the time. And there's a lot of value there, but you know, go and try and ask for 2 weeks or a week of a review and an assessment. And oddly enough, the military does that. They have these after action reviews where the rank doesn't matter. Everyone's allowed to speak and everyone says what worked and what didn't. So the military has this actually, and they're really good because they're relying on learning, right? They want to learn, they want to not get killed. But you look at any organization, it's not part of it. So organizations are really bad at learning, which then makes, you know, Polymath really not happy there because they're not even allowed to learn. And they also don't quite function in the same dynamics.
Yeah, they don't.
Specialists sort of do, but there's a whole conversation about the energy level you need to stay as on the highest top of a specialist compared to what a polymath can do.
Well, regardless of you're a specialist or generalist, the level of knowledge changes too, because like you said, it takes a lot more energy when you get to the high levels of specialty. But even just at the depth, as like the top 25%, it is interesting how much effort it takes us to keep up with it. So knowledge, especially like with coding, as you know, changes every year, if not every quarter. And so it is interesting to keep up with all that. So kind of an open answer question, what is the Internet of Things in your words?
Well, you know, the way they describe it, and well, I happen to work on a Kickstarter project of a Internet of Things.
The Things Network.
The Things Network over there, yeah. You know, it's just generally sort of all devices out there that can talk to each other and send data back and forth. So that's the Internet of Things. Interesting one is that Rob von Kranenburg, who's so he's leading a community called the Internet of People. And there is a lot around IoT or Internet of Things as well. And I think for me, it's I think in most cases, it's sort of that network, that ecosystem, and how people are talking about it. I think in a really short form, that's the Internet of Things. There's probably a longer discussion here around what does it mean? What does it mean to organizations? Because it's a little bit like blockchain, where if you have a lot of organizations work together, it becomes very powerful. If you have a lot of organizations silo it in and lock it up, then you're not getting a lot of benefit from it. So it's one of those internet things that, just like the pirate-based torrent technology, is amazingly powerful because it's a decentralized network. And you could do the same with the Internet of Things. They're very similar structures. And it's sort of a great idea. It's good stuff. The issue I normally see with that is that our economic system doesn't support that. So economic system is based on locking things up. And you have to free these things up. So, you know, Tim Berners-Lee, one of the inventors of the internet, he said, you know, he's now involved in open data and says, if data doesn't flow in an Internet of Things freely, the whole thing is pretty much a, you know, waste of investment.
Right.
So yeah, so it's that thing which could be quite beneficial. And I think there's a question of how beneficial it will be in the future.
Interesting. And I think that you made a good point of how, like, Internet of Things, IoT, and blockchain are both just like these almost ethereal concepts to some people. And then with companies who can work on it, make a significant difference. And then when they work together, it's even better. One thing I've been noticing is blockchain social platforms. So like DTube as an alternative to YouTube, or Hive, which is an alternative to like Reddit and Medium. And it's interesting how these platforms are developing. And I'm curious to see where they might lead. Where do you think, what can be done from like either connected devices like IoT or blockchain, for example?
Well, it's vast subject matter. I think the
Yeah.
benefits of it, it's tricky, is whenever you have a new kind of technology like, and I think the internet itself for a while was sort of a thing where you look at, in the beginning it was just a bunch of files, and then suddenly you have a tech coming along like hyperlinks. So hyperlinks that people are even hardly aware anymore what it is. It's basically it's just any button, anything you click on that sends you to another page. So a reference, a digital reference itself is an amazing, powerful thing, as the thing that made the internet. And those are the kind of things that create step changes. I think the low-hanging fruit is gone.
Mm-hmm.
So the question now is, because a lot of the benefits of internet and networks, especially social networks, you mainly still see in big cities, right? So everything is around there. A better example to talk about are things like Uber and Amazon being able to deliver within an hour. The second you get outside of these highly populated areas with high demand, things fall over, right?
Mm-hmm.
It suddenly becomes not valuable or sustainable enough for Uber to be somewhere in a small town.
Yeah.
There's just not enough demand, and it's a lost game, right? So that's a problem, because that means you can't scale those things in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
That's true both for the Internet of Things in particular, because it's hardware, so it's real stuff. And I think for social networks as well. If you go further out, there's just no one there.
Yeah.
So, you don't need a social network and an app and a digital solution in order to meet 5 guys in the local pub, because there's a local pub.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting how these things sort of fall over. At the same time, you can look out in Africa somewhere where IoT made a couple of really good deployments around, counting animals and tracking them, especially rare species, just to be able to preserve them and know what's going on and help them and see what's happening. Same with, bushfires and that. So you can have early warning systems that are actually really, really good, and they
Mm-hmm.
save lives, and they are worth doing. If you have a social network there, I don't know how beneficial that really is,
Yeah.
Depends, I think, so
Well,
it's tricky.
it kind of goes into the idea of smart cities or smart communities. And the last guest I was talking to on the podcast, we were talking about not just focusing on smart cities, but also breaking it down to the smaller communities. So like the people, like you said, if it's a community of just like 5 people trying to meet up, oh well. But what about all the little small communities around there? So for example, I'm in Missouri. I was learning about how city urban sprawl and why certain little micro townlets are made. And I guess about 100 years ago, when they were really kind of created, is because that was as long as a person could walk. It was about like 7 days or so,
Yeah.
or at the very least like 7 miles, I think it was, something like that. Not 7 miles, but some interval in between. And each city, little townlet, is based off of that little pattern. And so what if you can make a network of communities of those small townlets? That might be more worthwhile.
Yeah, I think when you look at smart cities or anything that goes into this new area of whatever the new area will be next, let's say it's solving wicked problems, like going into really complex problems and trying to do something about them,
Mm-hmm.
you'll get a lot into human behavior. Human behavior is still dictated by its context. So for example, if I just look at remote working, so remote working might be quite topical. So let's talk about this for a bit. It's the same thing, right? You have a network there, you have software, but what you're running into are already things like time difference. You can do nothing about time difference, right? So it'll always be a thing. So in my last couple of jobs, sitting in London, Europe, working with like Australia or Hong Kong, you got to get up early in the morning or super mega late. And so these kind of things still exist. They're really hard to solve, if not impossible, because that context won't change. Other parts, for example, are interesting as well. A couple of weeks ago, we did a bit of a survey around working from home and looking at, so I'm quite used to doing Zoom meetings and all these things, just maybe like you and whatnot. The interesting part was not necessarily that people know how to use Zoom and meet and do that. It was an odd difference between, at some point, people really loved the idea that, hey, tech is there. I don't have to drive there anymore every morning. I'm saving 2 hours commute, right? Awesome. I have more time, can sleep longer. I don't have to, you know, dress properly, so to speak, for the office, right? I can have short pants on.
Yeah.
There you go.
Not wear any pants.
Yeah, no, I'm wearing pants. I'm wearing pants. Just stating it right here. Yeah, I'm obviously wearing pants. The other thing is, what people were struggling with is then not knowing when, so their boss, for example, expecting them to be available after 5 o'clock. There was no visible marker in the behavior that people would see, so they couldn't react to each other. So everyone expected, like, oh yeah, I can just send an email and expect no response, or I can still give you a phone call after 5, and that's totally cool. And it wasn't, and people were really struggling with this. Like, I don't know what to say to my boss because he doesn't respect 9 to 5. That was one thing. The other thing that's really interesting as well is you had every time in the office, and I'm not just talking about the water cooler talk, which is sort of not a thing anymore because there's not any water coolers around anymore. There's probably I guess that's what is it? The WeWork beer tap might be the new water cooler, right? How healthy. So yeah, so you don't have that. So in the office, you actually see a lot of people all the time. You have chit chats here. You can walk up to someone's office desk or wherever they work. You see them in workshops. There's a couple of 100 times a day where you probably check back on lots of tiny things you hardly notice, right? Where someone sits, someone there is in a meeting or not. You're not at home, you have no idea what's going on. It's all gone dark, right? And even for someone like me, I've for a long time been quite introvert. I'm very much more happy with the one-to-one than with bigger groups. I can work with groups, I enjoy it on stage, in workshops, it's fine, I enjoy it a lot. However, my go-to place is still rather that. That's like, I'd rather meet one person, have a clear conversation with them than too many people. So I was quite good with that when COVID hit. Right. And I was quite happy, like, you know, I can just sit at home and no one's going to argue about it. Right. You know, because I sometimes had the tendencies at projects to leave at around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I had my work done and I would go and maybe work an hour at home. But even then, you're still kind of sometimes pulled aside, like, can you stay till 5 because people don't see you and they think you're not there? It's like, they know I'm there, right? They think I have half decent work ethic. It's like, yeah, but still, you know, it's that stuff. Yeah. And it's like, why do you need appearances if there's understanding communication? But it's not, right? And with COVID now, it's even less than that. At the same time, everyone's sort of okay with now being there because no one can be in the office. But people really suffered from the answers I got in the survey of, I don't know this, how can I check quickly? I don't want to go into a full Zoom meeting, so they don't do it. So there's a lot of uncertainty suddenly there, coming from the fact that I can check in with you, even if I just do it through a joke or whatever. Or I just check back on you because Mark asked me something on to do that. Do you have the list? Do you think red is okay? Yes, all right, fine. Now they're sitting there, don't get these answers. They might not have an established channel. Mm-hmm. So few, if not hardly any companies have looked at the teams, talked to everyone, go like, hey, so when do you get up in the morning? You don't have to get up exactly like everybody else, but if it's an hour later, that's great. Everyone has better time. If we have Zoom meetings, are we going to have those in the first 3 hours or do we have slots? Because I know you have to pick up your child. I know your partner is also there or needs the office at different times. What are your time slots? No one has figured this out. Because it's not like people at home have 2 offices if you have a married couple. Both have to work, right? In a lot of cases. So how do you deal with that? Both sit in the office, so just the camera out of sight kind of thing. Yeah. Going to have meetings at the same time. And when do you have your head down time, right? So when you put your head down and you work, when do you do that? And when can you have time for Zoom meetings? No one has even asked. So people are struggling with back and forth and are struggling with their focus. So they get less productive. Right. And I think that's what a lot of these technologies will run into too. The tech does one thing. The behavior is a big driver for what does it actually do?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've had video meetings for a decade now, and it wasn't until this year that like Zoom was really taking off, so to speak, that accelerant, so to speak. And it's interesting because I was talking to someone else on the podcast actually about this too, because it's interesting how people working from home start to get into their own rhythms again. And that 9 to 5 is actually not very natural. It was, again, made by Henry Ford and established to try to standardize everything. And because of that, people like me, who was a night owl, I I don't wake up early. I don't wake up mentally until 10 a.m. It's just now hitting 10 a.m. for me. So now the whole meeting's going to shift just because of that whole little wake up.
Finally, it's getting interesting.
Yeah.
Yay.
I was kidding. But it's interesting because like people are now working towards their natural rhythms. And so if they want to stay up late instead of waking up early, they can. And like you said, people aren't respecting that 9 to 5, but I think that's a good thing because then their quality of work is going to increase. And also too, I commented on your blog post, which relates to this, is like why you miss rubber ducking. And I wonder how we could stimulate this idea via the internet, and the concept of rubber ducking you might want to explain too. But I actually replied to that post, like I have, like, what can we do to stimulate this? And you replied back to me, I have a few ideas. So my question is, what is rubber ducking for those who don't know, and what are those ideas?
Yeah, so it's a thing I found around, I think, again, coding and development, because there's a lot of things where people try to improve the quality of work, of course. And oddly enough, you know, things like agile, they come from development. Haven't made it all the way to agile and strategy yet, but it's sort of dabbling with it. But a lot of these digital things come from where digital sits, which is with developers, right? So they're always trying to find new ways to improve things. Same with, you know, you had linear coding and eventually you had object-oriented programming, which totally shifted everything, made things more tangible, more complex, and be able to deal with it. So, so rubber ducking is essentially nearly what it says on the tin, which means you grab yourself a rubber duck or a similar inanimate object that represents maybe some conversation partner of sorts. So it can be anything. And you explain the ideas that you have to them. And that is actually true, you know, when you're on stage and you give a speech, same thing. When I was working on the book, trying to figure out what's my pitch here? What am I writing about? How do I describe this in simple ways that everyone understands? You basically explain it to that. And while you're talking, you actually start realizing, okay, maybe it is that. So it's actually not too far away from the old Greeks who would go for a walk and talk about stuff. Mm-hmm. To start mentally model things differently and therefore create better stuff because you'll understand it better. Mm-hmm. It's also similar, it's not too dissimilar as well to when let's say you build a service or you do a theater play or you try to write better conversation for that. If you play it out and you have the conversation out loud, you realize no one would say that. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't belong here. I wouldn't do that at that point. Mm-hmm. You know, so you're basically materializing it. There's other similar things as well we use in workshops with, you know, the design thinking. So Lego has started to be used for that, mainly to do the same thing. So Lego is super easy tool because everybody knows it. Everyone knows what to do. Learning curve is just there.
You're right.
And you bring out a big box of Lego and you say, right, okay, you want to design a service about X, Y, Z. And so show me, build it. Here's a build plate, build it out, see where things are. And when you do that, people realize, oh, hang on a second. The desk can be here. The person, if someone comes in here, first needs to be there. And you start realizing the flaws and you evolve very quickly. Not too dissimilar, there's an activity you can do to break the ice with the same Lego set because there's a lot of the figurines in it. Where you ask everyone in the workshop, because nobody knows each other likely, because everyone comes from different places, unless it's a department or a team. But even then, you know, there's a lot of things they don't know about each other. Like build your character and then walk me through it. Why you picked that, right? And often, because it's supposed to represent themselves, people do all sorts of things. You know, simple stuff is like, well, I'm sitting on a horse because I love horses. I actually ride horses. I do X, Y, Z. So people start talking about themselves. I had a really amazing conversation. So I was over in Saudi Arabia, and that was interesting because I was giving a workshop to a group of women and some men, and the women were all covered. So only saw the eyes, which generally already was like, okay, how am I going to work a room and read people in the right way in order to manage and interact with them? When we did the Lego thing with the identity, there was one woman and all she had done was like the box standard mannequin with a gray top on, right? That was it. So it was just a gray color then, that was about it. And there wasn't much to do about it, right? So I was like, okay, this can be a challenge. So I asked her, so why did you choose that? It's like, oh, there's nothing special about me, right? So really, you could feel the kind of Saudi Arabia and the country where women have still a particular restricted role to play. You could feel that literally. I was like, this is getting serious very quickly. I have to be able to be careful where I'm stepping with this. And she said, yeah, I'm not very, I'm not special. I'm not, whatever. So it's just a gray mouse there. And it's like, well, but why did you choose gray and not like the red or the blue that the others come with? Like, oh, well, I quite like it as a color, and it's like this, and I have a jumper like that and whatever. And it's like, oh, okay. So lovely. So, you still could get something personal out there. And that's sort of the thing where, that's the same effect you get with rubber ducking. You just start taking things out of your head into reality, and you check with reality, which is one of the most important things we have to do these days.
It's fascinating. And I hadn't heard the concept until you had brought it up. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. And one thing I wanted to move on to your book here is like in the chapter of your book, The Two Types of Smarts, you talked about polymaths and how they are a bit elusive for companies. Like, for example, when companies hire, they search for specialists when in reality, they need more of a polymath. How can we as in polymaths then market ourselves to be in a more conducive way?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's bizarre to me. I think you're fighting a mindset, and you're not just fighting a mindset, you're fighting organizational structure. The way a position in an organization is still defined is based on this industrial era factories. They're looking for one skill. You're a developer in this particular niche, not just a developer, you're looking for a Laravel framework or whatever specific. Or you're looking for those 4 tools that you can use, right? And we still have this. So I'm currently having that working on a transformation project for a company. And they're having a sort of a Spotify style team set up that is sort of entrepreneurial, and they're trying to fix a lot of problems with these multidisciplinary teams. They're not very multidisciplinary, but they're way step up from what they do before. In these teams, and I know this because they're a little bit like startups, you need 3 to 5 people who have multiple skills. It's not just that someone is a good developer or good designer or UX or service designer or good business analyst. You need someone also who understands business and stakeholder and client management, someone who can deal with the hierarchy, someone who could sell something, someone who could pitch something, someone who knows a bit more the context of what this means for customers. So before you know it, you're adding 5, 6, 10 different skills to this. Most designers, developers you get from the market are not like that, because they know if they're trained to work in any organization, in any silo, they're going to get hired just on that thing, and they get hired.
Yeah.
You have someone who's a bit different, has all these other things going on. People go, sorry, we couldn't really understand who you are and what you do. And I get that a lot. I got that a lot in my career. So I think there's maybe a couple of labels at this point. I would say help, there's this whole entrepreneurial spirit kind of thing, or you're a doer. A doer means you use any tools available and you just create outcomes, or you can say outcome driven and say, it's tricky because the big organizations still don't hire like that. I think they know about it, but the worst on top of that is even when they recognize it, right? And we're having this problem at the moment. So I'm at the moment trying to hire for some of those teams to help the client build this up and grow this and produce outcomes. From a cost point, from a budgetary point, they want a mid-level designer that costs X amount of money. Well, what we need is not just a mid-level designer. We actually need a senior, but not a senior on just above the mid-level. We need someone who has experience with these extra skills. So we need someone that's more valuable, but we're not even getting the money to hire those people. And at the same time, I've seen, therefore, on a lot of transformation projects, you get a very senior heavy team. Why? Well, they're not just designers, they're a bit something else. They're not just developers, they're a bit something else. They're not just strategists, they're a bit something else. Because they are entrepreneurial, so they know tons of other stuff. They know how to maneuver in any environment. Those are highly valuable people, just kind of T-shaped people everyone's talking about. But you would not find a single profile anywhere for someone to say, I want a T-shaped person. Oddly enough, the only place I found this so far, and that's really good news, I think, is some of the corporations started to look at this, and some of the universities have shifted, and I think I mentioned it in the book, some universities have shifted their entry requirements, where they say, look, if you're starting here, don't just have one subject matter area. Have something that sort of isn't quite the same, but sort of might potentially add nicely to it, or gives you variety and a different mindset. Universities are starting to say that, because they have figured out as well, even the sciences in their silos have run into dead-end streets. All these verticals, they don't connect. So you need people who can connect things, who are more comfortable to step out of their comfort zone or out of their own silo and start talking to other silos. It's starting in universities. Some, I think, progressive companies are doing that. They're looking for people with a particular mindset. I think they all vary a bit how they do that. And I'm not 100% sure if they really know why they're doing it. They just know they need different people.
So it's interesting because what you're saying is there's a lot of people, companies who need like the T-shaped people or even the unicorns, as some people say. And you mentioned how the people that are getting more of those senior teams, they're getting more people who are senior, maybe not in that one silo, but in general have worked in the field for a while with various different T-shaped disciplines. And it's interesting, I think the reason why they're senior and not someone who is a little bit more fresh on the block who can be a good fit for the role is that we don't have as many of those people because they haven't had the time to learn those skills. I do think as someone who's young can be a T-shaped person, but you have to have the grit to learn it because you don't have the school system to help you with it yet. The schools might be thinking, changing the mindset, but they haven't really changed much of their actions yet. One area I found this to be kind of important is the education system has stifled polymathic people and people who are T-shaped for a century now at this point. So how can we change education then? Like I said, the mindset, how can we change it to suit more polymathic and multi-potentialite people?
Yeah, I think the consensus most of the time there seems to be to teach people not on a particular skill set, but on being able to learn anything they will need to learn. They said that, I think McKinsey or someone from statistics, they say, you know, after you study, you go into the company, you know, 60-70% of your success or the stuff you need to learn, you learn at the company. Companies have started to not care about certain degrees anymore. The big ones, and there's always a bit of news when some of the last big ones go, you know what, you don't need a university degree anymore to start with us because we'll teach you what you need to learn anyways. So they're starting to shift that. So they're starting to basically cut out the educational system, and the educational system started to talk a little bit more about, let's teach people how to learn. Let's teach them the basics, but then teach them how to learn, and that's all need, because then they can have lifelong learning, because that's what we need and what we want. So the conversations are there. I don't know how much the curriculum is there yet, because I think it goes a long way for people to know what it means, and then be sure, you know, because when you just learn to learn and not particular facts that you can recite, how do you mark things? You know, it's like, oh, can you come up with some ideas? I guess you can now come with some ideas, but that's the most really hard to measure thing on the planet, right? You can ask someone how much 2 + 2. Where's the capital of XYZ? Okay, you can judge people on that, but you can mark them up on that. But it gets really tricky. You're getting into a more qualitative, not quantitative aspect, and I think that's where things always get tricky. And I think that's probably where we have to learn most and revisit how we're going to do that. And we have to do it, and we will. I'm sure we will somehow. Right now, still tricky, but you know, just conversations like that.
Yeah. So something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
I could rely back on the, I think, classic definition, which is sort of you have 2 or 3 skills of the top 25% or something like that, is what I read somewhere, that defines you as a polymath. I think it's probably a mixture, because you know, counting like that, I would maybe even take that number down and say maybe it's just the top. You're only on the top. You're even in the top 40% with more people, but then you have like more skills. You know, jack of all trades, or no, what is it? Was it master of none?
Yeah, so the jack of all trades, master of none, but also sometimes better than a master of one is the full saying.
Yeah. It's often a bit of a negative connotation, I found. You know, especially the master of none. It's like, we always need a master, because the masters have only one answer, and that gets to me back to some principles like, you know, the rule of the law of the hammer or something, you know, where you go like, you know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I've seen this, you know, I've seen people who grew up with like social media and suddenly thought like everything needs to be answered with social media. It's like, no, that's never happened, right? And there was never just one thing that solved the majority of problems. It was always like a mixture of things, first of all, and then that stuff evolved. So for me, polymath is like, yeah, it's you have quite a couple of skills, but not just that. I think you can connect the skills to each other somewhat. You have a mind that can associate between them, and that for me is, you know, I totally get off on things like combining Rodney Mullen and learning with the risk management of a corporation, right? Because, you know, in skating, we have a slam and a bail. A bail is when you know something's going on, you jump off the skateboard. A bail is when something unexpected happens, you break a bone or your face or something. So that's all the videos on YouTube. Those are all slams,
all the fail
not bails. Bails are boring, right?
Yeah.
So the bail you get back up from again. So and that's what companies want. They don't want to they don't want to fail, break, and lose millions and lose people and whatnot and do damage. They want to bail, right? So when Rodney Mullen talks about sustainable failure, that's something an organization can listen to. I go like, fuck, this is awesome. Like, you know, disconnect. This is the same. You guys talk about the same thing. You should listen to each other. Those moments, I think for me, are polymathic moments where you go, this is beautiful because those things are connected, you know? So you're curious about things, a lot of things, and you connect things in a different way. For me, is maybe even the more important characteristic of a polymath, maybe, you know, or maybe a new, different kind of polymath. So I like both things. One is the multiple things, but you can be quite I think your brain can still be quite a specialist brain if you just know a lot of things. But when you actually interconnect them and you keep making those connections, I think that is for me maybe more what makes you a polymath. It's also where the real strengths lies. So there's a really great article from a guy called Michael Simmons about that, which I'm sure you've come across. Yeah. So he had this one thing in there, and I think I reference it in the book, but he says a specialist is great and creates a particular amount of value because he spends a lot of energy on one thing. As a polymath, you have three things, but you can create the same value, if not more, because the three skills you have, you can combine in 6 different ways, and it gives you way more opportunities. And if you add it all up, you're actually more successful than a specialist. So why are we still relying on specialists for success? Polymath are actually, if you run numbers games, as if not more successful, and they have more variety and they keep learning. But a specialist stays with the same stuff and doesn't go out, right? So, but people don't think like that. So, but anyway, so that's sort of my 2 things on the polymath thing.
No, thank you for sharing. That's fantastic. And I saw that statistic you mentioned, like how polymaths are good at like the top 25% of many things. And I actually disagree with that statement because I think there's 2 kind of polymaths. So just to put it in perspective, I've been working on this idea of a polymath spectrum. So you have like a jack of all trades with a low competency. This jack of all trades and polymath don't mean the same thing. It just means they're both interested in many different areas. And then you have like a generalist with a little bit more competency and knowledge. And then you have a universalist and polymath. I also think there's kind of an extra tier of like a true polymath, someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who is literally a master of many different areas. So a specialist in many different areas versus a regular kind of polymath or a regular multidisciplinary Joe, so to speak, where they are the top 25, or as you said, quite astutely, top 40%. I think that's a very wise thing to say, especially now that knowledge is changing. So like maybe back in the Renaissance, someone who has a top 25% is a real expert. But nowadays, with the way that technology has changed the level of the game, how much knowledge you need to know, top 40 is probably much more applicable.
Yeah, I think it's a good assessment. I think it also gives us hope because it means more people, not just a few specialists or the few top polymaths are actually relevant. Because I think I've met a lot of people where they can learn. So I think there's way more people who have the ability to do so. They're just not being let.
So going off of something you said too about falling down with a skateboard or bailing, what do you think we can do as individuals or even organizations to fail quickly, and fall down and get back up again? How can we fall off the skateboard?
So this is where Troy, my co-host, would be great to have here because it's one of his love interests. It's all about context. Being able to create a context of failure is the main part. When they did, over at Google, they did a study of their teams and which teams are most successful in what they do. So they look for traits. Like, so, you know, what is it with the teams? Is it the specialism? Is it the skill set? Is it the smartness? What is it? Is it the rigor, the process, whatever? What they found, it's mainly social, soft skills. So one of the things was that in a successful team, most likely everyone in the team is allowed to speak. It's not going to be judged. And everyone's treated equal. Full stop. There you go, right? Same as the military review. You go like, you know, no ranks, everyone speaks. So the benefit you get there is you have a varied level of voices, which means multidisciplinary teams having different viewpoints on the same thing scientifically de-risks everything, produces better solutions and results. That's proven. So it creates that effect. The other part is also that people feel recognized. They are more likely to speak out because they know they can. And they're likely to speak out because they know there's not going to be any negative repercussions. If you create not that, no one will speak. Everyone will look to the project manager or to the product owner or to whoever senior person in the room, and we'll wait for that person to speak, and no one's going to say anything. And you will get no knowledge exchange, right? So you get knowledge exchange, you get constant learning as well. So we just recorded yesterday a podcast with Robert Rowland Smith, who wrote the reality test, which is strategy hitting reality and how that works. And he said one of those things we talk about listening, active listening, not passive, active, because passive listening is people in a room, no one's listening, everyone just says what they think they need to say and wants to get their point across. No one's listening, no one's sharing. In those teams that Google identified that are more successful, people are actively listening. Actively listening is a really important part in learning. That means everyone in the team learns something from each other rather than fight, right? And be the loudest person or the smartest person in the room. Those are two of the main traits of these teams, and they have nothing to do with how big your skill set is. So again, it supports the polymath, because a polymath is very open to other things. So they're more likely to listen. They're more likely to understand where other people are coming from, because they look at different bits and pieces. So I would argue, if you have any polymathic team there, you have those soft skills, those listening skills, more likely there, and people who want to listen to everyone, and everyone is allowed to speak, and failure is less of a thing, and everyone feels more trusted and safe in that environment. And that's important. If you don't have that, you can't fail fast, because people are just going to be miserable, and then they're going to leave, and they're going to be burnt out.
They're just going to be stifled in a way. And just something I mentioned before on the show is that, like, one of the first things I ever did when I started having guests on the show was evaluate myself. Are you a good listener? No, I'm a talker. I like to be chatty Cathy, gregarious, and be the extrovert, so to speak. And despite the fact I am an ambivert, the first thing I told myself, okay, no, these guests are giving you their time to come onto the show, work on active listening. That was like one of the biggest self-development skills that I had to work on in the past year or so. And I feel like I do decently well, but even just in that conversation there, I wanted to share this reference off based on what you're saying. And I told myself, no, stifle that down and listen to what he's saying, because what he's saying is really interesting and you can learn a lot from it. And so I'm hoping that with all these different shows, I can learn a lot from the guests. And so in order to do so, I have to be active listening.
Same for me, and I would argue that, so again, I was mentioning earlier with the introvert thing, but since I've been out and more outspoken, and I've been for occasions, let's say 10 years ago, I've been more likely being literally hired to be the smartest person, with the innovation guy, right? So what are we going to do? And like literally people asking me for answers. And I had to flip this around 180 degrees to go, no, hang on a second. You know more about your organization than I do. I'm here to listen. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Because the second I leave the room, you don't know what to do, which is one of those things also super interesting. If you ever read Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette, a US nuclear submarine captain. And he introduced this idea of active listening or intent-based management, where actually you don't tell people what to do. They tell you what they're about to do. And if anything is wrong with that, you interfere. Otherwise, you let them do it. Because they know what they're doing, right? Because they had the problem that whenever a captain would leave a ship, the performance would drop. The captain was always reliant or leveled up to the level that the captain was. So you had a bad captain, you had a bad ship. You had a good captain, you had a good ship. And they were going, why is this happening? Because the ship should be good, with or without captain, right? Because otherwise it means the people are not good, they're too flexible, right? So he changed the management style, and that massively improved, turned the submarine into the best ship in the fleet. Super fascinating book to read, how he tried to implement that. And this very hierarchy-driven context of the military, right? Super, super great. And he's a management consultant now, obviously. And so he's super interesting. I'd love to have him. So he talks about that. And it's the same for me. I had to switch this around. Same in the podcast still. I sometimes have to hold back because you have like, oh, I got a good idea for that. I got a good point for that. And you go like, no, let them talk. If your idea is really good, at the end of it, you'll still remember it. That's sort of how I anchor myself back down, because it is painful. Active listening also is this extra energy thing, right? If you just want to bring your own stuff out, you work with your A brain or with your system 1. And with system 2, it's higher energy, so it's more tiring to listen. And so it's not easy. And I'm wearing the same shoes here.
Yeah, I love how we both on the same page. And it reminds me of a book called Emotional Awareness, where it was Paul Ekman, who is a renowned microexpressions and body language expert, as well as the Dalai Lama, both of them having a conversation and explaining the science
Wow.
and philosophy behind it. And it's fascinating. They're both super open to each other,
Yeah.
and neither one of them have any issues with, like, even if they disagree with something, it's totally
Yeah.
fine. And in fact, that's the point. And that actually leads me to one of the other questions that I have for you that I just remembered I have to ask you, is that something off your profile that caught me right off the bat was that you said a happy mix between emotions and logic. So where do you find balance in your life?
I think I'm comfortable with not having the perfect balance in my life.
Mm.
Is a simple answer. I would.
What's the
And the
complex
thing for
answer?
that, well, the thing for that is maybe obvious, maybe not, is the fact that balance in itself is sort of an artificial thing. Nature is not built on. We like to think that nature is balanced, but it's not. It's a constant move and shake. So it's a wicked system, like it's a wicked problem system. It keeps evolving. It keeps doing things. Sometimes you can't notice it, but even when you don't notice it, we know it's happening, right? Everything we're trying to do with organizations or people and education and systems and society itself, right, is essentially trying to suppress that artificially. That's all we're trying to do. And that's why innovation or polymath or people who think differently are always on the fringes, because the core needs to agree on this artificial one truth or balance. If you don't have a balance, everything goes into chaos and you've got anarchists and blah, blah, blah. That's why dissent is such a problem for a society, right? Regardless if it comes from the left or the right. And that's obviously a very topical question, but I think for me personally, I think my artistic side runs a lot through emotions, and they're very qualitative. That's not logic. It's just like, I feel like it, I know it's right, or I really want to do this, or I think this is beautiful, I'll go for it. I think this feels right. So it attracts me, I go for it. And that's very important because it's a very, very powerful force. And even from nearly arguing from a logical perspective, latest science, that's why behavioral science is such a big thing these days, or it's just a growing subject matter, is that as a customer, as a consumer, when we make decisions, for a long time we thought there's a logical decision there. They have a look, different products, they compare, and then people make decisions. No, never happens. We make emotional decisions all the time, most of the time, right? So emotions are super powerful. The logic, though, is still that we need logic to make sense of things and bring things together. So we're trying as hard as we can with logic to explain often our emotional decisions. And I think that's a good thing, because I think it helps us compare things somewhat. It simplifies things, but it's a bit like language, if we couldn't simplify things into a language, as flawed as language is to communicate, we wouldn't have any way to connect. And if we can't connect things, then we can't make sense of things.
Right.
And then everything feels like chaos, and then we feel lost, and fear takes over, and then we might also be more easily to be manipulated, and we don't want that. It's like, it's really hard then to make a decision, because emotion, I would argue at this point, is the biggest driver. Definitely has been for me. I moved away from my country because I felt I didn't feel right. I felt there's something else. So it's always been the biggest driver in my world, in my life. And I think therefore I'm quite happy to embrace my emotions, and that makes them quite efficient. There's good and bad ones, but I think the more you get to know them, the better you can live your life.
Yeah.
And the logic I like as well, because it helps me maneuver around decision making certain ways, and it doesn't always have to be perfect. I think the nice thing about logic is that it's fun to play with it, and there's a place for it. But most logical systems, if you will look at that, be it math, be it psychology, or whatever it is, are basically abstraction levels, simplifications of what our emotions and the wicked world out there really looks like. Essentially reality. We're using logic trying to describe reality, and there's so many different ways of doing it. It has its place, and I think, yet again, I think the simple part to play for logic is to make sense and communicate those thoughts and ideas and feelings to other people a bit simpler. And that helps. That's a good thing. So they both have their place, and I play them back and forth. I got times where I'm more running on emotions, and sometimes more when I try to be a bit more logical. But the older I get, I think the emotional thing is becoming more powerful, because logic becomes more and more laughable, because you realize that none of it is the way it actually is. And
Yeah.
so it's sort
Our
of
perception is so
funny.
skewed, like just naturally our senses only actually pick up things very well. It's interesting though, the way you're approaching emotions. I actually created a philosophy called the 4 pillars about the mind, body, spirit, and emotions. And I think that picking your brain on that would be really interesting. So I'll have to have you on to talk about that and like smart cities
Cool.
and stuff like that. Yeah. So what is the future for you? Where do you see yourself going?
Well, so we had a book, we had a podcast. I'm working on these complex organizational projects. From a career perspective, at the moment, I'm looking at building the Wicked company out to help companies really become Wicked companies. So to help them with all these aspects. So it's a consulting approach. While I'm doing that, or while I'm building that up, the thing that naturally I think will happen, or I hope will happen, is the fact that the way I see management business consulting at the moment is just another industry that needs to be shaken up. Because whenever I see how clients deal with them and what they want from them, and the right questions are not asked, the right problems are not identified, it's outdated. It has no future. And I hope that I will play part of that future to redefine what this is. That's why I also try to call it applied consulting, because it does things a bit differently. But the main aspect is to take this idea of what a Wicked company would be, and now start to deliver that as a service, help organizations be like that, but also from a content perspective, having done the book and the podcast. I'd like to create a community around that, because there's tons of people who are a bit similar like me, and they can help me as much as I can help them. So I think we have to get together and write a couple of more books on some of the aspects of those pieces, because there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. I think they need to be further clarified, and more so, we need case studies. We need actually reality to that. That's one of the reasons why Troy and me agreed to podcast say we're trying to drive every book we find really into reality, because a lot of books are very theoretical. If you would read it as a CEO, you wouldn't necessarily know what to do. It's really tricky. And sometimes that's the point, because a consultant writes a book to get them into the door, as I do as well, to be honest. But the other part is to really connect these things with reality a bit better. And so I'm trying to spin out more books now on that, and I'm currently working on finding a publisher for the next few books and define on what's going to be. It's going to be 1, 3, 6. I might do 6 really small ones. I don't know. But the podcast, we're just about done a couple of episodes for now, a bit more looking for sponsors and things, and maybe community and something like that. So that's just on the financial side of things. Who knows, maybe there might be a conference. I don't think it's a bad idea to bring more varied people. Again, the Polymaths thing is a very nice backdrop as well, where you go, I personally like it, maybe because I'm a polymath, to bring lots of diverse people together, because I think that's the only way we can produce solutions of the future. And most conferences I've seen, very simplistic, very one way down, very silo, very vertical. And I don't think those things work, to be honest.
We need a Polymath convention.
They're boring. They're just sales pitches, and no one learns anything. Again, you just produce stuff, no one learns anything. Or you buy stuff, no one learns anything. Why don't we have things where we learn a bit more from, right? And build the right package where we can do this efficiently. So it's just spinning this whole idea a bit further and growing it, and maybe it becomes a milestone of sorts.
Well, yeah, for sure. Maybe, like I said, maybe we need a Polymath convention, so to speak. It'd be interesting too, because I talked to a lot of authors, and some people write their books with a very formal aspect. They get a publisher, they write out the outline, the script, or the text, and it takes them 2 years to do it. And there's other books by the same author that takes them maybe a month or 2 to do. They crank it out very quickly, especially during times like this. So I'm wondering what those next few books might be like. And then I was going to ask you, what is the deconstruction paradigm?
Apart from the fact that it was the first, the title for the book before the Wicked company sounded way better and more simpler. So deconstruction was sort of the way I thought about it beforehand. And again, I discarded it eventually because it was sort of a label that was confusing, and again, putting yet another terminology on something that then you had to explain again. The Wicked problem, at least, is something that's been existing for the 50s, 60s. There's books about it. So it's not like something brand new, trying to sound new or do something different, or doing the same thing with different name. But the deconstruction, I named it because of some of the characteristics yet again, both in the creative process, and I think also when you look at a wicked problem, just like Agile does, you need to deconstruct things. So in computer code with object-oriented programming, is the first time I came across some of that as well, where you take a big system and you just break it, deconstruct it into pieces, and you see what they all do, figure it out, improve it, and put it back together, and then you go forward. So it's part of a lot of these processes. So as a paradigm, I'm quite interested to understand how this works, how programmers do it, how creative people do the same thing. So it's oddly enough something that creative people and programmers could actually both agree on, but they rarely talk about it. So they have more in common than they think. The other part is that I think it's in a way we should approach organizations a bit like that too. We don't try to deconstruct organizations to improve them. We try to maintain them and latch new things onto it. So it goes to a new mindset. If you don't have that new mindset, if you don't shift your mindset, you'll not get into the future. It's just the way it is. And therefore, understanding it and deconstruction is a big part of that. If you don't deconstruct, if you don't break a few things down, we're not going to find new things. If you look at very simple answer to that, just if I look at COVID again, the way pubs were suddenly, what was two things? I saw the weirdest covers of in cabs, for example. One that had these plastic sheets all over the rider side and gaffer taped together. I saw in shops where suddenly the entry door, was a makeshift takeaway thing. So they turned a lot of shops into takeaway things.
Yeah.
Just by blocking the wall, taping things up and doing that and deconstructing how it was not an entrance anymore, it was something else, right? And then having the tables not right there where they were, but on the other side of the road, or had indicators on the other side of the road that you could stand there. So they were deconstructing the space and then producing something new.
Yeah.
And it's just what needs to happen. So deconstruction is a powerful idea, and that's why I choose it then and there. But since then, it's been a bit too abstract for me, so I discarded. The principle's true, but the name, don't really have to remember at this point.
Well, it's interesting though, and it kind of reminds me of like learning too, breaking things down and to smaller chunks so you can understand them better. And so, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on thewickedcompany.com, and my book's on Amazon. There's the Wicked Podcast, which you can find on iTunes, Spotify, and on Polymath. So I'm out there.
That's awesome.
I'm trying to post here and there, and every week there's a new podcast episode at the moment. So if you get close to me, you'll see me screaming about new things all the time. Come and say hello.
Yeah, it's really good stuff too. I was listening to it during the research. You guys should check it out. I'll make sure I have links in the description for you. In fact, I'm looking at my notes here. I got a lot of links. And so what is our call to action for the audience today?
Talk to me.
Well, besides,
talk to me, buy the book, listen to the podcast, the usual stuff. But I think, have a look at what wicked problems are and see how much they open up your eyes to the thing. Not the eyes were closed. So I had a few times where people came back to me after they read the book and said, look, this is great because I've always been thinking there's something like that, but I could never put it into words. Or I could never go back to my boss and say, actually, this is what I'm talking about. Look at this. These are the three pieces we need, right? So, and that makes me super happy. And I had a few people already, and that's enough for me. If I would have reached one person, well, I want to reach a few more people, but that alone, when you write, and book writing is a very lonely process at times. You go out and suddenly someone approaches you out of nowhere who doesn't know you and say, I like that. This is always what I wanted to say myself and couldn't. And thank you for you saying it. Now I can use it. So use it and abuse it. And I have in the book, that's why I put these 3 slides in the book as well. There's 3 of those. Give you some of the principles, ideas in there. Use them, just take them. Or send me an email and ask me for the actual digital slides because I have them in high res. So you use whatever's in there and just show it to your boss and talk about it, and I hope it helps.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's really interesting how when you're trying to solve these wicked problems, you do have to think things in a different way. And I think Polymaths by nature might actually have a better chance at doing so because of the interlinking brain. Alex Dunstan actually talks about linky brains and how these brains come together in very different connections. So I think that's a very good parallel there. Once again, I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and this is Marcus-Kirsch on the Polymath Polycast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dustin. It was great. And thank you for all the listeners.